She stood there proud as ever, watching her son graduate. But as the applause echoed, her heart sank. She had uncovered a secret so dark, it threatened to tear their family apart. With the crowd cheering and the camera flashing, she whispered just 4 words that would change everything. "Where is your other family?" What happened next will leave you speechless. Tell us your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more jaw-dropping stories. It was a day Sarah had been looking forward to for months. Her son James was graduating from high school, and the whole family had come together to celebrate this special occasion. The backyard was filled with friends and relatives, all cheering for James as he stood there, beaming with pride. The smell of fresh flowers mixed with the warm summer air. Sarah couldn't help but smile as she watched her son, his cap tilted slightly to the side, proudly receiving applause from everyone around him. It was a moment she had always dreamed of, the culmination of years of hard work, sleepless nights, and endless sacrifices. Yet amidst all the joy and excitement, something felt off. As Sarah moved through the crowd exchanging pleasantries with guests and offering smiles, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was wrong. She glanced over at her husband, David, standing near the grill with a drink in hand. To anyone else, he looked just like the doting father, the proud husband. But Sarah knew him better than anyone else. She'd been with him for over 25 years, and there was a subtle shift in his demeanor today. He was a little too quiet, a little too distant. He wasn't his usual self, warm, loving, and involved in every little detail. David was a man who could charm anyone with his easy smile, and today he used that charm freely. But it was the way he kept glancing at their neighbor, Lily, who had come to the party with her husband, that unsettled Sarah. Lily was a woman in her mid-40s, not much younger than Sarah, but there was something about her that made Sarah uneasy. She wasn't a stranger to her, but lately, Sarah had noticed Lily being around a lot more. The way she'd lingered during their last few conversations, the way she'd smiled a little too sweetly when David had been near. Sarah couldn't quite put her finger on it, but her gut told her there was something more to it. As the party carried on, Sarah kept her eyes on David and Lily. She saw them whispering to each other in a corner, their heads bent close together, their conversation too quiet to hear. Sarah's heart skipped a beat, and for a brief moment, she felt her chest tighten. It was probably nothing. After all, Lily was a friendly neighbor, but something in her gut told her that this moment was different, that something had shifted, something was wrong. A few hours later, Sarah found herself standing alone in the kitchen, glancing out the window toward the backyard. She could still hear the laughter and clinking of glasses, but the warmth of the celebration felt distant. Her thoughts were consumed by David and Lily's strange behavior. What was going on between them? Her mind raced and she couldn't stop herself from replaying the odd moments she'd witnessed earlier. Was she imagining things, or was there something more? The thought gnawed at her, a feeling she couldn't ignore. Her phone buzzed and she quickly looked down. It was a message from her old friend Mary, who had arrived at the party late. The message was simple but sent a chill through Sarah's spine. "Sarah, I saw something earlier that you need to know about. It's about David and Lily." Her heart pounded in her chest. She didn't know what to think, but she knew deep down that this wasn't just her overreacting. There was something happening, something big, and she couldn't shake the feeling that her whole life was about to change forever. As the party carried on, Sarah tried to push her thoughts aside and focus on the celebrations. She smiled at James, who was surrounded by friends, his face glowing with pride. She made small talk with guests, pretending everything was normal. But inside, she couldn't escape the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Her mind kept drifting back to the message from Mary. What had she seen? And why hadn't Mary told her directly? Later, as the evening sun began to set, Sarah slipped away from the party and into the quiet of the house, hoping for a moment of peace. Her mind buzzed with questions. She couldn't help but wonder, was she really just imagining things? Was she letting her own insecurities take over, or was there something truly happening between David and Lily? Just then, there was a soft knock on the door. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She didn't expect anyone else, at least not at this hour. Slowly, she opened the door, and there stood Mary, looking around cautiously as if she were worried someone might see her. Her face was serious, not the warm, friendly smile Sarah had come to know over the years. "Mary, what's wrong?" Sarah asked, stepping back to let her in. Mary hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Sarah, I've been meaning to tell you something," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "But I didn't want to upset you, especially not today. But I think you have a right to know." Sarah's pulse quickened. She had no idea what Mary was about to say, but she knew it wouldn't be good. She motioned for Mary to sit down, her mind already racing with possibilities. "I don't know how to say this," Mary continued, her eyes avoiding Sarah's. "I saw David and Lily earlier, when everyone was busy. They were talking by the side of the house. And Sarah, I don't know if I'm just reading too much into it, but it didn't look like just a friendly chat. There was something between them, something more. It's hard to explain, but I just felt like I was intruding on something private." Sarah's heart pounded. This wasn't what she wanted to hear, but it was what she had feared. "What do you mean private?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mary swallowed hard, her eyes glancing nervously out the window. "I didn't want to make a scene, but David and Lily were too close, and the way they were looking at each other. I don't know. It wasn't just a neighborly conversation. There was something else. I didn't want to say anything earlier, but now after everything I've seen today, I think you need to know. I think something's going on between them." The words hit Sarah like a ton of bricks. Her hands shook as she clasped them together, trying to hold back the tears that were threatening to spill. The image of David and Lily's whispered conversation flashed in her mind. Could it be true? Could David, the man she had trusted with her life, really be having an affair? Sarah took a deep breath and tried to steady herself. "What should I do?" she asked, her voice trembling. Mary hesitated for a moment before answering. "I don't know, Sarah. I can't tell you what to do. But just watch them. You'll see what I mean. If there's something going on, you'll notice it too." Mary stood up, ready to leave. She looked at Sarah with a mix of sympathy and concern. "I'm sorry to be the one to tell you this. I really am. But you deserve to know the truth, and I hope you'll be okay." As Mary walked out the door, Sarah stood there, numb. The weight of the situation felt heavier than ever. She had trusted David completely, and now everything was falling apart. The suspicion she had been carrying all evening now felt like a reality she couldn't ignore. She went back to the backyard, where the laughter and music still filled the air. David was talking to Lily again, laughing a little too loudly, looking a little too comfortable in her presence. Sarah's heart sank. She couldn't escape the feeling that her world was about to change forever. She knew one thing for sure now. She couldn't pretend any longer. She had to find out the truth, and nothing would be the same when she did. Sarah couldn't shake the images that filled her mind as she watched David from across the yard. The sight of him laughing with Lily was like a knife twisting in her chest. She had known David for so long, trusted him in ways that went beyond words. How could this be happening? How could he betray her like this, in front of their family and friends, on their son's most important day? She tried to keep her composure, but the weight of the truth hung over her like a dark cloud. The laughter around her felt distant, as if it were coming from another world. Her son's proud face, glowing with excitement, seemed like a cruel reminder that while everyone celebrated James's accomplishments, Sarah's heart was slowly shattering. The night carried on, but Sarah couldn't ignore what was happening right in front of her. David and Lily were inseparable, their conversation never straying too far from one another. Every time Sarah caught a glimpse of them, they were either too close or sharing a private joke. It was as if they had their own world, a world that didn't include her. Sarah excused herself, pretending she needed a moment to collect her thoughts. She slipped into the quiet of the house, away from the noise of the party. Her pulse raced as she paced around the kitchen, trying to make sense of it all. The words Mary had told her echoed in her mind, each one a painful reminder that something was terribly wrong. She knew she couldn't go on like this, pretending everything was fine. She had to know the truth, even if it meant facing the harsh reality of what had been going on behind her back. Sarah's thoughts swirled as she considered her options. Should she confront David now, in front of everyone? Or should she wait until they were alone, and she could ask him in private. As the party continued outside, Sarah quietly slipped out of the back door. She knew exactly where to go. It was a place she had never wanted to visit, the small, secluded shed at the edge of their property. It wasn't much of a hiding spot, but it was where David had always gone when he needed some time to himself. She had never thought much of it before, but now it felt like the place where all her suspicions might finally be confirmed. Sarah stood by the door for a long moment, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't sure what she was about to find, but she knew she couldn't turn back. She had to face whatever truth was waiting for her. With a trembling hand, she pushed open the door, stepping into the small, dimly lit room. The air smelled musty, but Sarah barely noticed. Her eyes quickly scanned the space, looking for anything that might explain the way David had been acting. And then her gaze fell on something that made her blood run cold, a small pile of photographs scattered across the table. Without thinking, Sarah walked over and picked one up. Her heart skipped a beat as she recognized the people in the photo. David and Lily standing close together, smiling in a way that was far too intimate for a simple friendship. The photo was recent, taken not long ago. And there were others too. More pictures of the two of them, alone together in different locations, at various times, always with that same private smile. It was enough to make her sick. The realization hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. David had been hiding something from her, something that she couldn't ignore any longer. Her hands shook as she dropped the photographs back onto the table. The room seemed to spin around her, and for a moment Sarah thought she might faint. How long had this been going on? Was this an affair, or was there something more to it? Either way, the truth was clear. David had been lying to her, hiding something that shattered the life they had built together. Her mind raced as she stood there, struggling to process everything. She thought of all the times David had smiled at her, held her hand, told her everything would be okay. All those promises now felt like empty words, lies she had chosen to believe. But there was no turning back now. Sarah knew she couldn't live in the darkness of doubt any longer. She needed answers, and she needed them now. She had to confront David, even if it meant breaking everything apart. With a deep breath, Sarah stepped out of the shed and walked back toward the party. The laughter and chatter still echoed in the distance. But this time, it felt like a cruel mockery. She knew that as soon as she walked back into that house, nothing would ever be the same again. As she approached the back door, she saw David talking to Lily once more. They were standing close, almost too close, and there was a look in their eyes, something that made Sarah's stomach churn. She didn't care anymore. The time for pretending was over. Taking one last steadying breath, Sarah walked up to them. She could feel her heart racing, but she didn't let it show. She had made up her mind. It was time to confront David. "David," she said, her voice cold and steady, "we need to talk." David turned, startled, his smile faltering as he saw the look in her eyes. Lily stepped back, sensing the tension, but she didn't leave. Sarah wasn't sure if it was out of guilt or something else, but Lily stayed, watching intently. "Sarah, what's going on?" David asked, his voice too calm, as if trying to hide the panic that was slowly creeping in. "Don't play dumb with me, David," Sarah replied, her voice rising. "I know what's been going on. I know about you and Lily." The words hung in the air, thick with tension. David's face went pale. For a moment he didn't speak. He just stared at her, as if waiting for the ground to swallow him whole. "I don't know what you mean," he finally said, but the words sounded hollow, like a weak defense. "Oh, I think you do," Sarah said, her voice shaking with anger. "I found the pictures, David. I saw everything. You and Lily hiding behind my back, lying to me. How long has this been going on?" David opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He glanced at Lily, who was standing there, her face a mix of guilt and fear. Sarah's heart broke even more as she realized that Lily had known all along, and yet had never said a word. The silence was deafening. Sarah's world had just crumbled before her eyes, and now, all that was left was the painful truth. "I loved you," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "I trusted you. And this is how you repay me?" David's expression shifted from shock to something else. Regret, perhaps, or guilt. But it was too late. Sarah had already made up her mind. She couldn't stay in this marriage anymore, not with the lies and deceit hanging over her. "Don't even try to explain," she said, turning away. "It's over." As Sarah walked away, leaving David and Lily behind, she could feel the weight of her decision pressing down on her. But there was no turning back now. As Sarah walked away from David and Lily, her heart felt like it was being torn in two. The weight of the moment crushed her chest, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. The anger and betrayal surged through her like a storm, pushing her forward, away from the life she had known. She needed space, time to think, but everything around her felt suffocating. She retreated to the corner of the garden, away from the guests and the celebration. It was still early evening, and the light was beginning to fade, casting long shadows across the yard. Sarah felt like she was trapped in that same shadow, suffocated by the secret that had been lurking in her marriage for so long. Her mind raced as she sat on the cold stone bench, the quiet broken only by the distant chatter of the party and the soft rustle of the wind. How had this happened? How had she missed the signs, the photos, the stolen glances, the lies? How had David been able to keep this from her for so long? She thought back to the good moments, the days when everything had felt right, when they had laughed together and dreamed of the future. Now those memories felt like they belonged to someone else. It wasn't just the betrayal that hurt. It was the realization that everything she had built her life on had been a lie. How could she look at James, their son, and tell him that the perfect family he had known was no longer the truth? The thought of telling him felt like a weight that would crush her. She didn't know how long she sat there, lost in her thoughts, but eventually the sound of footsteps broke her reverie. She looked up to find her son James standing in front of her. His face was full of concern, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Mom, are you okay?" he asked softly, his voice full of worry. Sarah tried to smile, but it felt fake, like a mask she couldn't hold up anymore. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just a little tired, that's all," she said, her voice trembling. James wasn't convinced. He sat down next to her, his youthful energy and optimism in stark contrast to the heavy sadness that had taken over Sarah. "Mom, what's going on? I can tell something's wrong. You're not yourself," he said, his eyes searching hers for answers. Sarah hesitated, unsure if she was ready to say anything, but in that moment, she realized that she couldn't keep this secret from him. James was growing up, and he deserved to know the truth. I I just found out something, James," she said quietly, her voice breaking. "Something about your dad and Lily." James's eyes widened in shock, and Sarah saw the confusion in his face. "What do you mean? What about them?" he asked, his voice full of confusion. For the first time, Sarah let her guard down completely. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Your father. He's been having an affair with Lily. I found pictures. I confronted him. And it's over, James. I don't know what's going to happen, but I need you to know that it's not your fault. None of this is." James's face turned pale. It was clear that he was struggling to comprehend the weight of her words. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The world seemed to stop as the realization sank in. "I'm sorry, James," Sarah whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "I never wanted you to find out this way, but you need to understand that your father, he's not the man I thought he was." James stared at her, his mind racing. Sarah could see the hurt in his eyes, the disbelief. She could feel his pain, pain that no child should ever have to endure. "I don't understand, Mom," James said quietly, his voice breaking. "Why did he do this? Why didn't he tell me? Why didn't he tell you?" Sarah didn't have an answer. She didn't know why David had done what he did, and she wasn't sure if she ever would. All she could do was hold James as he cried, both of them devastated by the wreckage of the life they had known. The party continued in the distance, but for Sarah and James, the world had shifted. It would never be the same again. The days that followed were a blur for Sarah. The party had been the last time she would ever look at David the same way. The shock of the betrayal was still fresh, but it wasn't just the affair that had shaken her. It was the consequences that came with it. She had never imagined that her life would unravel so quickly, so brutally. She tried to go through the motions of daily life, but it felt like she was moving through a fog. Her thoughts were consumed by what had happened, by the life that she thought was solid. now crumbling at her feet. The house felt empty without David. His things were still scattered around, but the presence of the man she had once loved was gone. Sarah knew she had to talk to David. The silence between them was unbearable, and they needed to figure out what would happen next. She had already made the decision to leave him, but there was still so much left unsaid. She needed closure, or at least the truth. The confrontation came a few days after the party. Sarah had asked David to meet her in their living room. It was a neutral ground, where they could both speak openly. David arrived, his face a mixture of guilt and defensiveness. He didn't say a word as he sat across from her. The tension was thick, and for the first time, Sarah could see the cracks in the man she had once adored. "I don't know what you want me to say, Sarah," David said quietly, his voice low. "I'm sorry. I never meant for this to happen." Sarah felt a surge of anger rise in her chest. "Sorry? That's it? That's all you can say?" Her voice cracked, but she didn't care. "You betrayed me, David. You betrayed our family. I trusted you. And now I'm left to pick up the pieces." David didn't respond immediately. He just looked down at his hands, unable to meet her gaze. "I never wanted to hurt you," he whispered, "but I've been so lost. I didn't know how to fix things." "Fix things?" Sarah repeated bitterly. "You don't fix things by lying and sneaking around. You don't fix things by breaking someone's heart." David's face twisted in frustration. "I don't know what to do anymore, Sarah. I don't know how to make this right." Sarah stood up, her body shaking with the force of her emotions. "You can't make this right, David. It's too late." She turned her back to him, the finality of her words hanging in the air. There was no going back now. She couldn't pretend anymore, couldn't live a lie. The man she had once loved was gone, replaced by someone unrecognizable, and now Sarah had to rebuild her life, one painful step at a time. The days after her confrontation with David felt like a haze to Sarah. Her heart still ached with the weight of the betrayal, but slowly something began to shift inside her. She was tired, tired of living in the shadow of someone else's lies, tired of waiting for answers that would never come. She was done with pretending, done with feeling helpless. The decision to leave David had not come easily, but it was the only choice she could make. She had spent years building a life with him, but that life was no longer hers. Trust, once broken, couldn't be repaired with apologies or promises. She needed to move forward, even if that meant walking away from everything she had known. Sarah knew that leaving wasn't just about her, it was about her son, James, too. She had to show him that it was okay to stand up for yourself, even when it meant making difficult decisions. She couldn't allow him to believe that staying in a broken marriage was the only way forward. She had to be strong, for both of them. The first step was telling James that they were leaving. She had already explained to him the situation, but she knew he was struggling to understand everything. He didn't want to believe that his father, the man he had looked up to for so long, could do something so hurtful. But Sarah couldn't let him live in denial, couldn't let him grow up thinking that love meant lying and hurting others. It wasn't easy to make the move. The house was full of memories, both good and bad, and it felt impossible to separate them. Each room seemed to hold a piece of the life they had shared, the laughter, the quiet moments, the family dinners. But there was also the betrayal, the hidden lies that had festered over the years, and Sarah knew she couldn't let those memories define her anymore. She started packing, one box at a time, carefully going through their things. She held on to some items that held sentimental value, but most of it was just stuff. Things that no longer felt important. Clothes, photographs, pieces of furniture. It all seemed so insignificant now. It was the memories that mattered, the ones she would carry with her as she moved forward. When she was finished, the house felt emptier than ever. It wasn't just the boxes and bags that filled the living room. It was the feeling of a life unraveling, a dream dying. But in the silence, there was also a sense of relief. For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt like she could breathe again. She called James into the living room to tell him it was time to leave. He had been quiet lately, still processing everything, and she could see the sadness in his eyes. He was no longer the carefree teenager he had been before. The weight of his mother's pain and his father's betrayal had changed him, and Sarah knew it wasn't something he would easily forget. "I know this isn't easy, James," Sarah said gently, taking his hand. "But we're going to be okay. We'll start fresh. You and me. We'll find a new home, a new life." James didn't say anything at first, just stared at her with those sad eyes. But then, after a long pause, he nodded. It wasn't the enthusiastic response she had hoped for, but it was the acceptance she needed. He was beginning to understand that this was for the best. As they walked out of the house together, Sarah felt a strange mix of sadness and hope. She had lost so much, but she was also gaining something. Control over her own life, her own future. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she had the power to shape her own destiny. The days following the move were some of the hardest Sarah had ever experienced. There were moments when she found herself questioning everything, wondering if she had made the right decision, if the pain of leaving would ever fade. But as the days turned into weeks, something unexpected began to happen. She began to feel a sense of peace. The apartment was small, and it wasn't much compared to the home she had once shared with David, but it was hers. It was a fresh start, a new beginning. The old house had held too many memories. Memories that, for a time, had seemed like everything. But now Sarah realized that the memories were just that. Memories. They didn't define her. She was more than the life she had left behind. James adjusted to the new living situation with time. At first, he had been resistant to change, but slowly he began to find his footing. He started spending more time with his friends, playing basketball again, laughing like he used to. Sarah watched him from the sidelines, grateful for the small victories. He was healing, just like she was. In the evenings, Sarah would take long walks by herself. It was her time to think, to clear her mind. As she walked through the quiet streets, she would often smile at the thought of the future, of a life that was no longer dictated by David's lies, of a world where she could make her own choices, where she could live for herself and for James. One evening, as she sat on a park bench, watching the sunset, Sarah realized that she had come a long way. The hurt of the past still lingered, but it no longer had the power to control her. She had taken back her life. And though the scars would always be there, they no longer defined who she was. The phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled it out, seeing a message from her old friend Mary. "I'm so proud of you, Sarah. I know it wasn't easy, but you did the right thing. You're stronger than you think." Sarah smiled to herself, her heart swelling with gratitude. She didn't need anyone's approval to know that she had made the right choice. She had made the hard decision, and in doing so, she had found her strength again. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, Sarah felt a renewed sense of hope. The future was hers to create, and this time she was in control. Sarah thought that moving on would be simple, that once she stepped away from David, she could finally breathe easy. But life had a way of throwing unexpected challenges her way. Despite everything she had been through, there was still one thing that loomed over her like a dark cloud: the unfinished business with David. She had told herself that she was done with him, that nothing could make her go back. But the reality was that their past wasn't so easily erased. There were things left unsaid, decisions left unmade, and Sarah, despite her best efforts, couldn't escape the feeling that some sort of closure was needed. David had tried to reach out several times, leaving messages and texts, each one more apologetic than the last. He seemed truly regretful for what he had done, but Sarah didn't know if she could trust him again. She had heard his promises before. His words, no matter how sincere they seemed, no longer held any weight. One afternoon, as Sarah sat at the small kitchen table in her new apartment, she found herself staring at her phone. There was another message from David. This time he was asking to meet. She hesitated for a long moment, her finger hovering over the screen. She didn't want to see him, didn't want to hear his excuses, but deep down she knew that if she didn't confront him, the past would continue to haunt her. Finally, she made the decision. She would meet him, not for him, but for her own peace of mind. She needed to look him in the eye and hear the truth from his mouth, no matter how painful it might be. She needed to see if there was any trace of the man she had once loved still left inside him. The meeting was set for that evening, at a small cafe near the park where they used to walk together. As Sarah arrived, she saw David sitting at a corner table, looking older and more worn than she remembered. He stood up when he saw her, his face filled with guilt and sadness. "Sarah," he said softly, his voice shaking, Thank you for meeting me." Sarah nodded, not sure of what to say. She had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in her mind, but now that it was happening, words felt inadequate. David motioned for her to sit down, and she reluctantly took a seat across from him. They stared at each other for a moment, the silence stretching between them. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, Sarah," David began, his eyes filled with regret. "What I did to you was unforgivable. I betrayed your trust, and I ruined everything. I'm so sorry. I don't even know how to begin making it right." Sarah clenched her hands together on the table, trying to keep her composure. "You can't make it right, David," she said quietly. "What's done is done. You can't undo the past. The trust we had is gone, and I can't pretend it isn't." David's face fell, and for a moment he seemed at a loss for words. "I've been thinking a lot about what I did," he said. "And I know that no amount of apologies will ever fix what happened. I understand if you never want to see me again, but I had to tell you that I was wrong. I was selfish, and I hurt you in the worst way possible. I know that now." The words hung heavy in the air. Sarah could feel the weight of his remorse, but it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to make her forget the hurt, the pain, the betrayal. "You're right," Sarah replied. "You were wrong, and I don't think I can ever forget what you did. But I also don't want to keep living in the past. I have to move forward, David. For me, for James. I have to rebuild my life, and I can't do that while I'm still holding on to the person I thought you were." David nodded, his eyes filled with sorrow. "I understand," he said quietly. "I just wanted you to know how sorry I am, and I'll always be here if you need anything." As Sarah stood up to leave, she realized that this meeting, this confrontation, was the final step she needed to take. There was nothing left to say. She had faced him, heard his apologies, and now she was free to move on. The past, while painful, no longer had a hold on her. She stepped out of the cafe, the cool evening air hitting her face. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the world lift off her shoulders. It was over, and for the first time in months, Sarah felt the smallest spark of peace. In the days that followed, Sarah found herself slowly but surely embracing the new life she had carved out for herself. It wasn't easy, and the pain of the past still lingered, but she was no longer consumed by it. She had faced the hardest part, letting go of the life she thought she would have, and now she was starting to rebuild. James, too, was adjusting. They both were. Slowly, Sarah began to rediscover pieces of herself that had been buried for so long. The parts of her that had been lost in the shadows of her marriage. The woman who had dreams, passions, and hopes for the future. She had spent so many years taking care of everyone else that she had forgotten what it felt like to take care of herself. She joined a local art class, something she had always wanted to do, but never had the time for. She started taking long walks through the park, reconnecting with nature, and finding a sense of peace in the quiet. She even began dating again, though it was slow and hesitant at first. She wasn't ready for a serious relationship, but she wanted to remind herself that love didn't have to come with pain, and it certainly didn't have to come with betrayal. Sarah's life was no longer defined by what David had done to her. She was learning to define herself, to rediscover the woman she had always been before the hurt. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it. And when she looked at James, she saw a young man who was also finding his way. He was stronger now, more resilient. The bond they shared had only grown deeper through everything they had been through. They had each other, and that was enough. As Sarah looked to the future, she no longer saw a life filled with fear and uncertainty. She saw hope. She saw possibilities. She saw the woman she had always been, standing tall, ready to face whatever came next. She had found her strength, and that was all she needed to start again. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. Sarah had learned that healing wasn't a straight line. It was a journey filled with ups and downs, moments of doubt, and moments of clarity. But as time passed, the weight of the past seemed to lift just a little more each day. Every morning, she woke up and chose to face the world anew. The strength she had once thought she lacked was becoming her guiding force, and with each step she took, she felt herself reclaiming more of the life she had lost. James was thriving. His grades had improved, and his friends, who had been a constant support, continued to encourage him. He was no longer the boy who had silently carried the burden of his father's actions. He was growing into a young man who understood the importance of respect, honesty, and self-worth. Sarah watched him with pride, knowing that their bond was unbreakable. They had survived the worst, and together they had emerged stronger. Sarah's days were filled with new experiences, ones that she had never imagined in her years of marriage to David. She continued her art classes, each stroke of the brush helping her express the emotions she had long kept bottled up inside. The canvas had become her therapy, her outlet. She painted scenes of beauty, of peace, and of healing. The colors flowed with purpose, as if each painting was a reflection of her journey. She had always been creative, but it was only now that she truly allowed herself to explore it fully. Her confidence grew. She found herself standing taller, both physically and emotionally. There were still moments when memories of David would surface, but they no longer controlled her. She had confronted the pain, acknowledged the hurt, and chosen to move forward, and it had made all the difference. One evening, as she sat in her small apartment, looking out over the city lights, she realized something profound. She was happy, not in the way she had been before, when happiness had been built on the foundation of a marriage that had once seemed perfect, but in a way that was real, raw, and truly her own. She had found joy in the simplest things again, in laughter with friends, in the quiet moments spent with James, in the feeling of her paintbrush gliding across the canvas. Sarah had finally understood what it meant to live for herself, to stop seeking validation from others, and to embrace her own worth. For the first time in a long time, she was at peace with who she was and where she was headed. One day, as she sat in the cafe she often frequented, she caught sight of David walking by the window. He was alone, his posture slumped, his face filled with the same regret that had marked their final conversation. He caught her eye for a brief moment, and in that instant, something shifted inside her. She felt no anger, no bitterness, just a quiet understanding. She didn't need an apology anymore. She didn't need him to validate her pain. She had already forgiven herself. David gave a small, hesitant wave. Sarah nodded, a soft smile crossing her face. It wasn't forgiveness that needed to be said aloud. It was the acknowledgement that she was no longer tied to the past. She had learned to set herself free. The next few months were filled with new beginnings. Sarah became more involved in her art community, connecting with people who shared her passions. She even started hosting small exhibitions, where her paintings told the story of her journey, of love lost, of pain endured, but most importantly, of strength regained. And when Sarah looked at James, she could see the same strength in him. They had walked through the darkness together, and now they were both stepping into the light, ready to face the future with hope and resilience. In the end, Sarah had learned that true happiness doesn't come from the people around you or the life you thought you would have. It comes from within, from the decision to heal, to forgive, and to move forward. She had done all of that, and now as she stood at the threshold of a new chapter, she knew that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The past was a part of her story, but it no longer defined her. She was Sarah, the woman who had faced betrayal and emerged stronger. And as she looked out into the future, she knew that anything was possible. A new chapter had begun, and she was ready for it.